The European Union may bar American travelers when it opens its borders to some countries from July the 1st due to the U.S. failure to control COVID-19 at home. And as trade disputes, tariff threats, and disagreements over NATO budgets and defense create uncertainty, where is the U.S. EU alliance heading? Is the U.S. role changing, and what are its responsibilities as a global power? How will transatlantic interactions shape the post-COVID-19 world? To talk about these issues and more, I'm joined by Professor John Gahn of the University of International Business and Economics, Rick Dunham, former White House correspondent for Business Week, and Professor Joseph Toker from the American Graduate School in Paris. That is our topic. This is Dialogue on Julia. So let me start with you, Professor Toker. German Chancellor Angela Merkel warned that Europe needs to reassess its relationship with the United States if the U.S. is no longer willing to shoulder its responsibilities as a global power. What exactly did Chancellor Merkel mean by that?
Well, I think for once, in spite of the fact that we're speaking about a political figure, she really meant what she said. But I remind us all that this intention or this ambition of the Europeans in general and Angela Merkel in particular is not a new one. We're speaking about actually for some decades, if we would like to have some perspective. We're speaking for a long time here in Europe about the need, the necessity and the wisdom of rethinking Europe-US relations. Now, of course, the accelerator, the great accelerator of all that was in November, almost 4 years ago, when President Trump entered the White House, and with the positions of Trump and the actual clashes between Merkel and Trump, verbal ones and not just verbal ones. So there is a need, of course, to rethink everything, to rethink security, to rethink economic issues, to rethink trade agreements, and to rethink the overall geometry, world geometry. Well, what is Europe? What is precisely the modern post-COVID or pre-COVID new positioning, and what does it mean in terms of repercussions on military balance, or diplomatic capacity, or commercial energies? So yes, I think we should take Angela Merkel and President Macron and other European leaders by their word on that.
Rick, what is your take? Because the transatlantic alliance has been alive and well for many decades. What has changed? Is it simply because of Trump?
No, not exactly. First, the transatlantic alliance and liberal democracy in the post-Second World War era did lead to great economic advances in Europe and in the world, but that's changed. And we're 80 years after the war started in Europe, and do we still have to have the same kind of economic geography as we did back then? The world has changed, and these alliances need to change. The second thing is that Donald Trump is a disruptor, and combined with his ally Vladimir Putin, he's trying to do in Western Europe and the expansion of Western Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so I think you have these two issues converging. We do need to have a different change because the world has changed, but Donald Trump has reminded Europe that there is a need for reassessing the reliability of America if there is a president who is unreliable.
And John, how does China view that divergent views between Europe and America, especially after COVID-19 happened?
I wouldn't rush to characterize it as a divergence right now. I think there are different voices both in the United States and in Europe. I think there's a voice in Europe that still calls for very strong cooperation with the United States. And there's also, other voices in the United States opposing Trump's view of the United States' role in the world. His view is basically, withdraw from these international institutions. He doesn't want the United States to be the policeman of the world, as he called it, and he, is resorting to a very sort of narrowly minded American first policy. And certainly there are a lot of people in the United States disagreeing with that. So I think, there are different voices on both sides. But I think at a fundamental level, there's still quite a close relationship between EU and the United States, mostly due to the ideological commonalities. But there are also divergence of interests in other areas. For example, Germany and France, they have their own economic interests vis-à-vis China, for example, vis-à-vis Russia, for example. And on these issues, United States and Germany and France certainly don't agree on a range of issues. So I think it's a quite complicated picture out there. The jury is still out there whether there's some kind of a unified directional movement. I think at this point it's in total chaos. I mean, look at what Pompeo is saying, what President Trump is saying. They're not saying the same voice, in my opinion.
Let's talk about interest a little bit, because Trump said that he will put out roughly 10,000 troops out of Germany, and he said that Germany hasn't paid his due. That is 2% of GDP for defense. Do you think he has a point? Because Germany promised to increase their spending on defense.
Well, he's been saying this since day one. When he first visited NATO's headquarters opening. Remember, this is like 2 or 3 years ago, I think, when NATO opened its new headquarters, and he was basically saying the same thing. So I don't have exact information about exactly whether Germany has stick to its promise that it will increase its defense budgets, its commitment to NATO. But I suspect that this is something he wanted to do anyway for a long time. He wants to move the U.S. troops out of Germany into Poland, because if the U.S. is injecting, some money into the local economy, it probably would be better off, from their perspective, better off spending the money in Poland. I think U.S. has a huge influence in Poland vis-à-vis Germany, for example. So this is not surprising to me. So that's what I'm thinking, what's happening here.
So, Joab, do Europeans have second thoughts about how to maintain their security if the United States pulled more resources, probably out of Europe, or moving to Eastern European countries?
Well, it isn't just the factual moving of some U.S. troops from Germany further east or further north, whether it's going to happen or it will not happen, because what counts here are the tendencies and the type of emphasis of these steps or others on the overall thinking of foreign policy and strategic issues. So the figures are not that important, neither the ones regarding the battle of figures between Berlin and Washington regarding what Germany actually paid or did not pay or will be paying. That's marginal. What is important is the overall perception of where does Europe stand if indeed the assumption is not anymore the one which had accompanied the world, and certainly Europe, since the end of World War II. And it isn't, the assumption is different. So in spite of the fact that we've heard about the European need to rethink its security interests and security apparatus, we haven't seen the Europeans being able over the last 50, 60 years to do something significant about it. So things are being accelerated since the arrival of Trump because of the sense of urgency that this disruptive U.S. president had given to the entire world, and specifically in Europe. So there are different thoughts on that in strategic circles in Germany, in Italy, in Britain, although the British case is a different one, in France, and there are plans. I mean, there are plans all over the place, but whatever the plans are and whatever ad hoc situations would oblige the Americans and all Europeans and all Russians and all Chinese to behave, we're still a long way from a significant, profound, altered situation when the basic thing is still that the transatlantic alliance stands, perhaps not in the way we've been accustomed to the way it stands over the last 2 or 3 generations, but it stands. It's the #1 priority amongst those players. Western Europe, Northern America, in spite of everything, together.
Rick, do you think this might be just an aberration? Because there is going to be an election in November in the United States. Will things come back to normal when there is a new president who happened to be a Democrat? If that is the case, will things change?
That's an excellent question. I do think in a lot of ways Trump is an aberration. He does not speak for a majority of Americans. He speaks for a particular viewpoint that's rather extreme within America. However, the question is, if Trump is gone, if Joe Biden is president, does this mean a restoration of the traditional American foreign policy, or is everyone starting to rethink? And I think that the process of rethinking has taken place already. The big question a lot of allies, historical allies of the U.S. have is, can we rely on the United States? Could there be another Trump in the future, and what do we do in case that happens? So I think Joe Biden could make a big difference. I don't think that he would go through with some of the extreme moves that Trump is likely to make in the last few months of his presidency, assuming a defeat. But I do think that the allies, particularly Germany and France, have to think of the future and what America's role is in the future. I do think that there would be a rapprochement with Western European allies, and in fact with a lot of the governments of the former Soviet Union. But I think that things have changed forever because there are questions about America's role in the world and America's reliability.
And Joe, I also want to talk about economic and trade relationship. There seems to be a breakdown in negotiations over the subsidies paid to European aviation manufacturers Airbus. And Trump is planning to weigh tariffs of $3.1 billion on EU and also British exports to the U.S. How will the EU respond? Is that another round of trade war between Europe and America? Joab?
I'm sorry, is the question to me?
Yes.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, we should anticipate on new tariff type issues and on new variations of a trade war, if not a trade war, at least a trade sort of ambush situation all over the place. It is already the case between the U.S. and China. It is already the case between U.S. and Russia. It is already the case between EU and Russia, and it may very well be the case, although it's now on a lower fire, so to speak, between Europe, between the EU and the United States. So all partners will, every now and then, at least threaten others in all kind of tariff arrangements in order to polish the positions they'll be entering in as they will be negotiating. And because there will be negotiations, we're not speaking yet about a level of gravity of the tension in the world in which actors are not negotiating with each other. We're not yet there, and I hope we'll never get there. So yes, I think it's already on the agenda if you follow just current affairs in terms of what the Americans threat they will be doing to European merchandise, German and Italian and French champagne and others, and the other way around, although on somehow more discreet tone, the other way around, maybe threats from the European direction towards America if things get bad.
And also British is another interesting factor, because Britain obviously is in the Brexiteer process, but also a special relationship with the United States of America.
Right.
How will this triangular relationship develop? Britain, Europe, and America?
Well, I think Washington will probably foster better relationship with UK, especially.
You mean favorable trade policies?
I think definitely for sure. I think well, I mean, there's a context behind President Trump's recent threat of imposing tariffs on EU on a couple of products, and I think.
But won't depend on won't impose on the
UK, right?
Kingdom.
That's right. And I think it's actually it's quite pathetic. And I'll tell you the real reason why he is doing this. It's a real threat, basically. This has everything to do with the second congressional district in Maine, okay? Because Maine has a very unique system. They count votes tied to particular congressional votes, or congressional districts. And there's one vote out of Maine that he has a chance of winning. And he's doing this trying to help with the Maine lobster farming community to sell more lobsters to EU, okay? And in a way to win. I mean, this is a very
So you're saying domestic politics is playing again?
It's purely. I think the recent announcement of threatening tariffs imposed on European community is purely out of this election consideration. Okay, it's about the second congressional district in the state of Maine, and I think this is pathetic. This is really a sold out American long-term interest for a pathetic vote out of this mostly democratic state of Maine.
And Rick, what do you think? Will the election year force Trump to play tough economically on EU?
I think everything that Trump does, that the administration does, has to be looked through from two prisms. One is re-election. I mean, winning 4 more years in office is Trump's reason for being for the next few months. The second thing is that many people in the administration see the possibility that his rule is about to end in January, and they want to get as much of their ideological agenda enacted as possible. So I think tariffs, since Donald Trump is the tariff president, are going to be imposed again and again and again, allies and foes. But I do think that the #1 motive for any action of the Trump White House over the next few months is what will help us get to 270 electoral votes? What will help us get to what is necessary to win another term in the White House?
And how much does COVID-19 fit into this? Because according to some reports, EU prepares to open its borders to travelers, but not to Americans,
right.
Nor Russians or Brazilians. So when cases rise in Europe, Trump placed travel bans on most EU countries back in March. Somebody say this is a tit-for-tat retaliation, but you have to know that America is not a good picture in terms of containing this virus. Rick?
In this case, I am not going to be a cynic. I do not think that this is retaliation by the EU. I think this is protection of people of Europe from the countries that have done the worst job in containing, and that is the federal government of the United States, that is Brazil, obviously, and Russia. They've done a terrible job, and India, I think, is on the cusp of that. What makes me really feel sorry as an American is where I live in Virginia, in the Washington, D.C. area, people have done exceptionally well. In New York City and New York State and Massachusetts and Connecticut, people have done exceptionally well, but we are being weighed down by Republican states and Republican governors and Donald Trump not taking this seriously. So I do think that COVID will be an issue that is very sensitive politically in the U.S., and I do think it will also be a flashpoint in U.S. EU relations, at least until the end of the Trump era.
And Joe, what do Europeans think of America federal government's response to COVID-19? And do they blame Trump in some way for failing to contain this? Because Europeans have been struggling with this as well, but it seems that you are out of the depth of it.
Yes, you're right. There are a whole set of variations and nuances amongst the ways different European leaders and different European governments have held the battle against COVID, which is still going on. We're far away from speaking, from even approaching the post-COVID era, let it be in Europe or in America or in Asia. But yes, absolutely. I mean, Europeans think in a very clear way, let them be political leaders or just the man and woman down the street, that the American federal, centralized behavior and policies, rather the lack of sufficient federal and centralized policies regarding the battle against COVID, is a shameful one. And you hear that in different places in Europe, which were rather loose and relatively not so strict in comparison to others. Places like Austria, places like Switzerland, some of the Scandinavian countries, which had already, which had also applied policies which did not seem to be strict enough, if you compare them, say, to the way the French government had handled the sanitary situation, or the Spanish or Italian one. Oh yeah, and not only do Europeans think that the way the Washington behaves is shameful and serious and grave, they also think that this will not be, the repercussions of those will unfortunately not be limited to North America, because we're all on the same planet fighting the same virus, or maybe other viruses, and whatever is not happening properly in Washington would have direct effects on Europe and Asia and elsewhere.
We've also collected some opinions on the internet on the EU-US relationship. Let's take a look what some of them have been saying. There's a lot of different opinions. This one, Joe, said that Donald Trump has brought America to its knees. Europe is appropriately placing a travel ban on us. This is a continent we saved twice in the past century, and they are now afraid of us. America is isolated under Trump. We are on our own. Rick, I also read an article on Atlantic saying that America has become a pariah state because of its failure to contain this virus, which is supposed not to be doing like that. What do you think as an American?
Yeah, I think that using the word pariah is a bit provocative here. I think that Donald Trump is a pariah politician in most of the world. I don't think the United States is seen that way, although I do think that Trump's government is seen that way by many traditional allies around the world. I think that, I mean, who does Donald Trump help? He helps people who want chaos in the world and want traditional relationships to be destroyed and damaged. But I do think it does reflect the world reassessing the reliability of the United States. And I think that's bad for America. And really it's bad for the world, because the United States has been a force for stability and growth over the decades since the Second World War. And I think having an unreliable United States really brings a sense of uncertainty to the world that probably is not a good thing overall.
Maybe isolated in some way, but still, the politicians of the United States is trying to do things in the other direction. On Thursday, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declared that the U.S. accepted a proposal to create a new U.S. EU dialogue on China that is being put forward by EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell. So, will Europe join the United States to apply pressure on those talking points that Mike Pompeo pointed out? Joel?
I don't think so. Oh, sorry.
Joel?
Yep. Yes, I think so. Well, when we're looking at the overall picture, not necessarily regarding specific details along the road of the negotiations, or rather the difficulties which are there at the outset of these negotiations, which brings me back to what I tried to express a few minutes ago, namely that regardless of the important modifications and changes that the reassessment, rethinking set of procedures has already showed it is capable to do to everybody, to the Americans, to the Chinese, the Russians, the Europeans, everybody. And due to the fact that the world is more tense right now than 6 months ago, or even 5 or 10 years ago, perhaps, in spite of all that, the basic assumptions, and I refer right now mainly to this transatlantic major assumption which had accompanied us since the end of World War II, but even prior to World War II to some extent, namely USA and Canada, together with Western Europe and Central Europe to some extent, will still stay some kind of pillar, basic cement pillar, which would not have the full effect we were accustomed to, say, during the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union and its allies, but would still be the #1 factor in thinking the entire picture. Now, within the entire picture, the nuances would be larger and more significant, but this single major central pillar will remain valid.
Rick, you don't agree. The pillar is not as strong, and they have more divergent views, especially probably on China.
Well, and that's the point I would like to make. Yes, there's a lot of commonality of interest between economic interests between U.S. and the EU. However, I think the EU is trying to find a middle ground with regard to China. If you believe that the American viewpoint is going to be to contain China, if you look at the rhetoric of Donald Trump and particularly Mike Pompeo, I don't think the Europeans agree. Pompeo is trying to have it both ways and enlist Europe in his campaign against China. I think that Europe shares many of the values of traditional American foreign policy, but I don't think Europe right now, particularly with Trump in charge, wants to be seen as part of the anti-China bloc. So I think that there's some tension there.
John, of course, Europeans and Chinese don't necessarily agree on a lot of things. For example, investment protocols, human rights issues, and a lot. But do you think Americans will be successful in placing a wedge between Europeans and Chinese, especially in trade and economic cooperation?
Well, I think I need to give credit to Pompeo. He has actually done a pretty good job of going around the world, sort of, preaching this message, the message of sort of awakening to China's rise as a challenge, right? And I think he has been,
do Europeans buy this?
I think there are many European politicians buy into his argument. For example, the dialogue you mentioned, EU-US dialogue on China, is another speech he delivered at the Democracy Forum in Copenhagen. There are people in Europe, politicians in Europe would adhere to his message. So I think, as I said in the beginning of the program, in Europe it's a complicated picture. There's a different voices. There are people who sort of more prone to maintain a good relationship with China. We share a lot of common interests. We share a lot of commercial interests. But there are also a lot of people in Europe buy into this ideological argument. I mean, the whole Pompeo's message is based on this very outdated ideological argument. He framed this thing into Cold War context, basically. And I think as a former CIA director, he did a damn good job being a propagandist, in my opinion.
Okay, Joe, I have 1 minute left. Do you think the Europeans will finally come up with a strategic thinking on its relations with China and the U.S.? We have 1 minute left.
No, I don't think that within the foreseeable short run or even medium run range, the Europeans will be able to synthesize and to have an integrated common position. I think that blocks will be starting to be formed and ideas will be forwarded, and perhaps the first signs of something more coherent on these issues or on the majority of these issues will be visible. But I don't think that in 6 months from now there will be a EU policy which will be clear-cut in regarding neither China nor the U.S.
Okay.
There could be crisis situations which might oblige the Europeans to take ad hoc positions. That's a different thing.
All right. We are running out of time. Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Rick. And thank you, Joel. And thank you for watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Goodbye for now.